I want you to just close your eyes for a second and picture something.
Oh, this should be good.
Yeah, well, actually keep them open if you're driving or walking the dog, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I want you to picture Himalayan water.
Right. Okay.
What immediately comes to mind? If you're like most people, you're probably visualizing these pristine, untouched, icy mountain streams.
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe you're even picturing like a really expensive luxury bottled water brand with a sleek, snow-capped peak on the label. We just have this collective assumption that because the Himalayas are so high
Yeah.
and so remote, the water flowing out of them has to be the purest stuff on Earth.
It is a deeply ingrained image. And honestly, it makes complete sense why we hold on to it.
Right.
I mean, we naturally associate high altitudes and glacial ice with absolute purity. It's comforting for us to think that somewhere up there at the top of the world, the environment is still completely untouched by human hands.
Well, today we are going to completely shatter that illusion.
Yeah, we really are.
And we aren't relying on, a few scattered anecdotes or isolated water samples here. For this deep dive, we have our hands on a massive, comprehensive, systematic review. It was published in the journal Chemisphere in 2025.
It's a huge study.
It really is. This research team didn't just conduct a single study. They synthesized data from 274 different studies spanning from 2003 all the way to 2024.
Wow.
So they essentially built this 20-year master timeline just to find out what is actually flowing inside that water.
Right. And before we get into the specific chemistry of what those 274 studies uncovered, we really need to establish the sheer scale of what we are talking about.
Yeah, lay it out for us.
Because the Himalayas are not just a picturesque mountain range acting as like a dramatic backdrop for mountaineers. They're fundamentally known as the Water Tower of Asia.
The Water Tower of Asia.
Exactly. We're looking at a geographic region spanning 230,000 square miles. The glaciers and snowmelt from these mountains, they feed the major river basins of the globe. I'm talking about the Ganges, the Indus, the Sangpo Brahmaputra.
So you can basically think of the Himalayas as the ultimate upstream reservoir for all of South Asia.
Yes, that's a perfect way to put it.
And if you have a tainted reservoir at the very top of the mountain, absolutely everything downstream feels the impact. I mean, this water supports over 60 million people directly in those immediate high-altitude regions.
Which is already a staggering number.
Right. But then when you factor in the downstream reliance for agriculture, for sanitation, just the daily survival of massive populations, you are looking at hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
So the defining question for our deep dive here is, what exactly is tainting the ultimate upstream reservoir?
To answer that, we really have to look at the geography. Because the Himalayan region is so incredibly vast, you cannot just treat it as one homogeneous block of ice and rock.
Okay, that makes sense.
The researchers actually broke the data down geographically to isolate where the contamination is hitting hardest.
And I actually have that breakdown right here. The researchers tested the water for essentially a whole periodic table of heavy metals.
Oh yeah, they looked for everything.
They looked for cadmium, copper, manganese, lead, zinc, arsenic, barium, chromium, uranium, just a massive list. And the geographic divide is pretty stark.
It really is night and day.
So let's look at Nepal and China first. The data shows that the heavy metal levels in those regions are relatively low. In Nepal, they actually found 0 heavy metals exceeding the World Health Organization's standard permissible limits.
Right, although manganese was flagged as a slight concern, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. Manganese was a slight concern, but nothing officially crossed the danger line. And in the Chinese Himalayan region, only arsenic and aluminum exceeded those WHO safety limits.
Which, is still a concern, but it establishes a really crucial baseline for the rest of the study.
How so?
Well, those lower levels in Nepal and China show us what the water looks like when it's primarily influenced by natural geologic weathering.
Right.
Over millennia, water slowly dissolves, the rocket flows over, and it picks up trace minerals. That is a completely natural process, but the data completely fractures when you move across the map to the Indian and Pakistani Himalayan regions.
Yeah, the danger zones are just glaring. In India, the levels of cadmium, lead, arsenic, chromium, and uranium, they don't just exceed WHO safety limits, they completely blow past them.
It's terrifying.
And Pakistan's water is overloaded with nickel, lead, chromium, and mercury. We aren't talking about trace amounts anymore. We are looking at severe toxic overloads.
And what's fascinating here is that aggressive spike in specific elements points directly to human activity.
Because it can't just be the rocks anymore.
Exactly. You simply do not get massive, concentrated spikes in lead, chromium, and mercury just from natural rocks washing away. What the data reveals is the footprint of rapid urbanization, massive highway infrastructure construction, and unregulated industrial discharge.
I really want to pause on that because when I think of the Himalayas, I don't necessarily think of heavy industry or highways.
Most people don't.
Right. So how does a highway construction project cause a spike in something like, I don't know, chromium or in a mountain stream?
It really comes down to the mechanics of modern development.
Yeah.
When you carve a massive highway through a mountain, you aren't just moving dirt around.
Right. You're blasting.
Yeah, you are using explosives to blast through deep rock formations. And that exposes fresh mineral veins directly to rainfall for the first time in millions of years.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah. And then you have the machinery itself. You've got diesel emissions, asphalt runoff, and the wear and tear of massive tires. Those tires are actually heavily laced with zinc and cadmium, which wash straight into the streams.
That is wild.
And combine that with local unregulated industries, like tanneries that use heavy chromium salts to treat leather, and then they just dump that wastewater directly into the river system. It basically creates a highly concentrated heavy metal cocktail.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've established the water in these specific regions is highly contaminated with this heavy metal cocktail. The immediate question is how this is actually impacting the human body.
Right, the health risks.
Yeah, does the danger only come from drinking a glass of this water, or is there a serious risk just from interacting with it?
Well, the study measured both ingestion, so drinking the water, and dermal exposure, which is physical skin contact. And across all the regions tested, ingestion is by far the most dangerous pathway.
Which makes sense.
Right. Consuming this water leads to severe non-carcinogenic risks, meaning widespread systemic bodily damage as well as high carcinogenic risks. So a greatly increased probability of developing cancer over a lifetime.
But I was reading through the risk assessments, and there was one specific finding that completely stopped me in my tracks.
The Pakistan data.
Yes, the data out of Pakistan, specifically regarding dermal exposure. We know drinking it is lethal over time, but in Pakistan, the skin contact risk for nickel is just off the charts. The researchers use this metric called the hazard quotient to measure this risk, right?
Yes. The hazard quotient is a really vital metric. It's essentially a ratio that compares the level of exposure a person is receiving to the highest level of exposure considered safe.
And the baseline is 1.
Correct.
A hazard quotient of 1 means you are at the absolute limit. Anything over 1 means you are facing a documented detrimental health risk. Well, the dermal hazard quotient for nickel in Pakistani children is 34.53.
Yeah, 34.53 is a catastrophic number.
It's unbelievable.
It really is. It means the exposure is roughly 34 times higher than the maximum safe limit. And we need to be very clear about the physical reality of that metric.
What does that actually look like for someone living there?
It means that simply washing hands, taking a bath, or doing laundry in this water is profoundly dangerous. It bypasses the digestive system entirely.
But how does a heavy metal just absorb into your skin like that? I always think of metals as these hard, impenetrable things, like a chunk of iron.
It's a common misconception. When metals like nickel are dissolved in water, they exist as microscopic ions or salts.
Okay.
So when you bathe in warm water, your pores open up and your skin's natural lipid barrier is compromised. The nickel ions are small enough to pass straight through the epidermis.
Oh, that's terrifying.
They bind to the proteins in your skin and enter the bloodstream directly. At a hazard quotient of 34, the heavy metal is absorbing at toxic rates just from a quick wash.
Which brings us to, honestly, the most heartbreaking finding of this massive 20-year review. Children are bearing the absolute brunt of this crisis.
They are, disproportionately.
Across all the tested regions, children are significantly more vulnerable to both ingestion and skin contact. Let me share the hazard index numbers for India.
Please do.
So the hazard index takes all those individual quotients we just talked about and combines them to show the total overlapping risk. For adults in India, the arsenic hazard index is 12.34.
Which is already terrible.
Right, because 1 is the danger line. 12.34 is awful. But for children, that arsenic hazard index jumps to 28.82. It's more than double the adult risk.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the biology perfectly explains the tragedy of those numbers. Think of an adult body as a fully built house.
Okay.
If heavy metals enter that house, it's like a rock being thrown through a window.
Right.
It causes damage, it's dangerous, but the structure is already established.
Right, the foundation is set.
Exactly. But a child's body is a house actively under construction. Their nervous systems, their organs, their brains, they're actively forming.
Yeah.
When heavy metals like arsenic, lead, and mercury enter that developmental process, it's like mixing toxic sludge directly into the wet concrete of the foundation. It warps the entire structure from the ground up.
Because they have a much lower body weight, right?
Right.
So a smaller dose results in a massive concentration in those developing tissues.
Precisely. An adult might experience localized or systemic toxicity over time, but a child's entire developmental trajectory, their cognitive ability, their physical growth, it could be permanently derailed.
God. Well, if the situation is this dire, my immediate thought goes back to that 20-year timeline you mentioned at the start. We have data from 2003 all the way to 2024.
Right.
So are the environmental protections and infrastructure projects we've put in place over the last 2 decades actually doing anything? Because here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, the data takes a weird turn here.
It does. When you look at the aggregate numbers in the study, it genuinely looks like a massive victory.
It does appear to be a victory on the surface, which is where data interpretation becomes so critical.
Okay, walk us through it.
So the researchers tracked a metric called the degree of contamination, or DOC. This metric combines the total volume of all pollutants in the water. From 2003 to 2013, the DOC sat at 138. But in the most recent decade, from 2014 to 2024, it plummeted to around 49. They also measured a pollution load index, which dropped from 2.68, which is classified as highly polluted, down to a very clean-looking 0.29.
I mean, any politician or local leader would look at that spreadsheet and start celebrating.
Oh, absolutely.
The overall indexes are dropping dramatically. It seems like the water is objectively getting cleaner, so we should be celebrating, right?
Well, no. That assumption is the exact trap the researchers are warning against.
Wait, really?
Yes. While the aggregate index dropped, making it look like a statistical win, the water remains fundamentally classified as highly contaminated and wholly unsafe for domestic use.
How does that work?
You have to look really closely at what is hiding inside that massive drop in the aggregate data.
Well, I pulled the specific elemental breakdown for 2014 to 2024, and yeah, the drop in the index is completely misleading.
It's smokescreen.
When you actually isolate the data, the levels of the most highly toxic specific heavy metals like cadmium, nickel, lead, and mercury, they actually increased compared to the older data and the World Health Organization standards.
And this raises an important question about how we read scientific data. It's a classic statistical paradox, and it highlights a major flaw in how broad pollution indexes are used by policymakers.
Give us an analogy.
Think of a student whose overall GPA goes up because they suddenly got an A+ in gym and art, even though they are actively failing math and science.
Ah, okay.
The overall GPA looks great on paper, but they're failing the core subjects.
So in this case, the gym and art grades are the benign pollutants.
Yes, exactly. Environmental regulations are often very good at filtering out bulk pollutants, things like suspended silt, basic dissolved solids, or common agricultural runoff.
Easy stuff.
Right. When you reduce those high-volume, relatively benign elements, the total pollution index drops dramatically. But those broad filters often miss the highly complex trace industrial metals.
Oh, I see.
So the broad volume of pollution goes down, dragging the index with it, while the lethal heavy industrial metals quietly accumulate to deadlier and deadlier levels.
That's terrifying.
The water is theoretically, quote-unquote, less polluted by volume, but it is vastly more toxic to the human nervous system.
So it's basically a smaller volume of a much deadlier poison.
Exactly.
That is just awful, especially when you remember the hazard index of 28 for those children we talked about. So the water is completely unsafe to drink, and in places like Pakistan, it is dangerous to even wash your hands in it.
Right.
But what about agriculture? Globally, about 70% of all fresh water is used for farming. If we can't drink the Himalayan water, can we at least use it to irrigate the crops that feed those hundreds of millions of people downstream?
You would certainly hope so, given the immense agricultural reliance on these river basins. But the data on irrigation suitability presents a totally different yet equally severe crisis.
Now, I actually want to push back on the farming aspect a little bit.
Okay, go for it.
Because I was looking at the basic water tests in the study, and things look perfectly fine for agriculture.
On the surface, maybe.
Well, the pH of the water is completely normal, hovering right around 7.3 to 7.6, which is pretty neutral. And the electrical conductivity, which is the basic test for salt levels, is totally acceptable.
Right.
So if the pH is neutral and the basic salt isn't crazy, the crops should be fine, shouldn't they? I mean, dirt doesn't get cancer from heavy metals.
It is a very logical assumption. You're right. Dirt doesn't get cancer.
Hmm.
But soil is not just dead dirt.
What do you mean?
It is a complex, living, breathing chemical matrix. And that matrix can absolutely be destroyed by the wrong water chemistry, regardless of how neutral the pH is.
Okay.
The researchers didn't stop at pH. They evaluated deep irrigation metrics, specifically focusing on total hardness, potential salinity, and residual sodium carbonate.
Okay, let's break those metrics down because total hardness sounds a bit vague to me.
Sure. Total hardness basically measures the concentration of calcium and magnesium dissolved in the water. To give you a sense of scale, water is considered very hard if it has over 180 milligrams per liter of these minerals.
180 is the threshold. Got it.
Now, let's look at Pakistan's data again. The total hardness of their Himalayan water is an astronomical 1,622 milligrams per liter.
1622.
Yes.
That's nearly 10 times the threshold for very hard. What does water with 1,622 milligrams per liter of hardness even feel like?
I mean, imagine taking handfuls of crushed chalk and just dissolving them into a single bottle of water. The water becomes physically heavy, totally laden with dense minerals.
Wow.
And furthermore, the potential salinity across these regions is far above the safety limit of 3 milliequivalents per liter.
So what does this all mean? Like, what happens when a farmer actually pumps that chalky, highly saline water onto a field of wheat or rice? How does the soil react to that specific chemistry?
It triggers a cascading chemical failure in the earth.
A chemical failure.
Yeah. When water has extreme hardness, high salinity, and high residual sodium carbonate, it causes a process called chemical precipitation. The excess sodium in the water forcibly replaces the natural calcium in the soil structure. And when that happens, the individual soil particles lose their structure and they pack tightly together.
Oh, no.
In plain English, it turns the fertile soil into solid concrete.
It literally paves the field.
It destroys the soil's permeability. Water can no longer penetrate the surface, air cannot circulate underground, and the natural organic matter trapped in the soil cannot decompose.
That's a disaster.
It completely suffocates the root systems. A root cannot push through concrete, and it cannot extract nutrients without oxygen. So, despite having a perfectly normal pH level, this water will slowly degrade the agricultural land until absolutely nothing can grow.
Man, we are looking at a compounding dual crisis here. Let's trace the full picture of what we've uncovered today.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. We started with this pristine, mythical image of pure Himalayan mountain water, the snow-capped peaks, the luxury brands. But the rigorous data from 274 studies over the last 2 decades just shatters that image.
Completely shatters it.
Because of unchecked human activity, from highway blasting to industrial tannery runoff, this massive upstream reservoir is heavily tainted.
And we've seen how deceptive the broad data can be, too.
Right.
The overall aggregate pollution numbers look like they are improving, which creates this false sense of security. But that statistical paradox hides the reality that specific, lethal heavy metals like lead, mercury, and cadmium are actively increasing.
The water is profoundly unsafe for drinking, posing massive cancer risks and systemic toxicity. And it's heavily disproportionately affecting children whose developing bodies just absorb these metals like a sponge.
Yeah.
And then in some areas, the nickel levels are so high it is toxic just to wash your hands.
Which is still hard to wrap my head around.
And as a final blow, we cannot simply pivot and use this water for farming because the extreme hardness and sodium levels will chemically turn the soil into concrete, suffocating the roots of the crops that hundreds of millions of people rely on.
It is an incredibly sobering reality. And, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over for everyone listening.
What's that?
The study mentions that fixing this crisis is essential to meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals, specifically SDG 6 for clean water and SDG 3 for good health. But let's look past the bureaucratic goals for a second and think about the physical global supply chain.
Where does that lead us?
Think about the agricultural data we just discussed. If the water used to irrigate the vast farming regions of South Asia is chemically hardening the soil and lacing it with toxic levels of cadmium, lead, and arsenic, where are those crops actually going?
Oh, wow.
South Asia is a massive exporter of rice, wheat, and agricultural goods to the rest of the world. You might live thousands of miles away, you might never buy a plane ticket to see the Himalayas, and you might never drink from those mountain streams.
Right.
But if that heavy metal cocktail is baking into the soil and being absorbed by the crops, you might already be eating Himalayan water.
That is a very unsettling perspective to walk away with. The borders of an ecosystem are never truly closed, are they?
No, they aren't.
Well, the next time you turn on a tap or see a commercial for pure mountain spring water, I hope you remember this research and rethink the hidden, complex chemistry flowing through those streams. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the data, and we will see you next time.